On October 8th, 1921, Paragon won the Duke of York Handicap at Kempton Park. A rather bizarre story emerged in the Derby Daily Telegraph on December 30th of that year concerning Captain Owen Peel returning £3,500 he'd won on Paragon in the race. That would be just worth over £100,000 nowadays. Apparently he'd bet on the horse with about 40 bookmakers, but a post office delay meant his telegrams making the bets were delivered a few minutes after the result was known. The paper wrote that bookmakers invariably accept a dated telegram as being acceptable as a legitimate bet, though it had been abused in the past. The paper said that Captain Peel may be commended by some on his actions, as he had felt the closeness of the dispatch of the telegrams with the running of the race was an issue. However, they felt the racing world in general would consider him foolish, because if Paragon had lost, he'd be expected to pay the stakes he'd bet with. They felt he must be a wealthy man, as there was no reason to return the money he was clearly entitled to, and they couldn't understand why he'd acted this way. This contrasts with that of a well-known society person whose mother had owned Pavilion, who had won the 1919 Grand National. The Flintshire County Herald later that year, and in glowing terms, mentioned this man's wedding to the daughter of Sir Robert Jardine, who was a leading racing owner in 1920. Sir Robert was in fact a steward at the Kempton meeting we are talking of back in October the 8th. Later this man, not Jardine but the man I was originally talking about, was described as one of the most popular young men in society. Anyway, one bookmaker declined to make a bet made via telegram by this person, and the post office were investigating. Next February 1922, the Postmaster General was taking out a summons against the issue. It was against Captain Owen Peel. Yes, the Derby Daily Telegraph's confusion over the issue was now explainable. The allegation was that Mr. and Mrs. Peel had used their influence on the local postmaster, as they were well-known people in the area, to alter the times the telegrams with the bets were handed on in. Captain Peel had admitted the wrong times on the telegrams, which was an offence in itself, but the prosecution stated there was no evidence that the result was already known to the couple. Winning money now was claimed to be £4,500 rather than £3,500. Captain Peel said he placed such a large bet because the trainer told him the horse was a good thing, but Galpin, who trained the horse, denied this in court. The Pall Mall Gazette wrote that the court was full of well-known racing society people. There was also elsewhere massive press interest in the case. Again, Pall Mall Gazette reported a sensation on March 7th, 1922, as Captain Peel suddenly pleaded guilty, with his wife pleading not guilty. Apparently this came to a surprise to all. On March 13th, Captain Peel's chauffeur was fined £10 for driving Peel's car without a licence. This had nothing to do with the case, but I'm just pointing out that the captain could afford a bleeding chauffeur, so shouldn't really have needed the money in the first place. The next day, the captain was sentenced to 12 months imprisonment at Wormwood Scrubs. A moment of humour in court came when one bookmaker's representative said Captain Peel had been a satisfactory client, to which the judge replied, "What, does that mean he generally lost?" to laughter in court. It became clear that Captain Peel's father was the person who paid back the money in December, although I don't know how he found out what the Peels had done. Mrs. Peel was acquitted in the case of the steed being backed. Part of the reason was her wife was seen as being under the influence of her husband if they were committing this sort of crime. Justice Darling stated this was by then an absurd legal situation, and if he'd really believed Captain Peel had coerced his wife, he'd have given him a larger sentence than 1 year. Imagine a scene from Dickens's Oliver Twist, published in the late 1830s. "It was Mrs. Bumble. She would do it," urged Mr. Bumble, first looking round to ascertain that his partner had left the room. "That is no excuse," returned Mr. Brownlow. "You were present on the occasion of the destruction of these trinkets, and indeed are the more guilty of the two in the eye of the law, for the law supposes your wife acts under your discretion." "If the law supposes that," said Mr. Bumble, squeezing his hat emphatically in both ends, "the law is an ass, an idiot. If that's the eye of the law is a bachelor, and the worst that I wish for law is that his eye may be opened by experience. By experience. Harry Seacombe in the musical Oliver did that scene of Mr. Bumble much better. Only 2 weeks later, the case was the subject of a debate in the House of Lords. Coming directly after a long debate about the Irish Free State, Viscount Ullwater directly referenced Mr. Bumble. In May, the Lord Chancellor admitted a committee to look into the law relating to the wife's responsibility in these sort of cases, and the law was radically changed in 1925. Captain Peel was released late in December after serving 9 months due to good behaviour. By February he was back with his local hunt. In March 1927 the Peels had been divorced due to adultery by the captain, and Mrs. Peel gained custody of their child, who sadly died in World War II. Mrs. Peel married John Drummond, the Laird of Medic. Drummond's sister was the first British woman to serve a full apprenticeship as an engineer, which just goes to show the complete farce of the former Peel's not guilty verdict given the times. She also gained £100,000 in 1920s prices when her father died. In September 1928, Captain Peel was involved in a legal argument over the purchase of a horse, a case which he lost. He was being paid £125 a month by the now Mrs. Drummond, but she managed to have that stopped.